The sun was high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the winding river that snaked through rice paddies and emerald fields. At the water's edge, a boy named Dan stood staring at the current. Only 8 years old, he had already seen more tragedy than many grown men. That day, his little sister Lon was gone, carried away by an accident so mundane, yet so devastating, it haunted the entire family for years. From the distance came the clacking rhythm of a bicycle spinning wheel. Hours before, little Lon had jumped at the chance for a ride on their neighbor's old rusted bike. She'd perched behind the seat, swinging her legs carelessly, until one slip wedged her foot between the spokes and the frame. The spokes cut deep. In panic, the neighbor pressed a handful of muddy earth against the wound to stanch the bleeding, inadvertently sealing in bacteria. Within days, infection and high fever overtook Lan's body. She died in her sleep, leaving the entire family in silent shock. In the time that followed, Lan's mother refused to believe her daughter's spirit had departed completely. Dan, too, clung to memories. But neither could have guessed that far beyond the horizon of those grief-laden days, fate was weaving a story that would bring Lan's soul back, reborn into a new life in the same region, yet under a different family's roof. This is a story of reincarnation, familial bonds, heartbreak, and hope, set among the lush valleys and winding rivers of a land steeped in ancient customs. It is a tale of how a girl lost to an untimely death somehow found her way home again. 12 years slipped by like sand through an hourglass. Dan grew taller, his once round cheeks hollowing out with adolescence. His mother's hair turned streaks of gray. His father passed away from illness some years back, leaving them to manage the family farm on their own. During these years, the village also changed. A dusty road was paved. More sturdy brick houses replaced thatch roofs. Traders from other provinces arrived in greater numbers. Yet old beliefs remained. Many villagers still consulted mediums when unexplained phenomena occurred, or prayed to ancestral spirits for guidance in difficult times. Dan was now 20, quietly responsible and protective of his mother. He seldom spoke of Lon, but every year on the anniversary of her death, he walked the short distance to a simple stone marker overlooking the river, where they had scattered her ashes. He recited prayers, lit incense, and left a small bouquet of wildflowers. Meanwhile, in a neighboring village only a couple of kilometers away, a family named Lowe lived in a traditional stilt house, common among the local highland communities. Mr. Lowe farmed corn and raised chickens, while Mrs. Lowe wove textiles on a wooden loom. They had 3 children, each with a strong Muong heritage that manifested in their everyday life, from the music they played to the architecture of their stilt home. The youngest was a daughter named Mai, 8 years old, bright-eyed, inquisitive, always running off to chase dragonflies. For months, Mai had become increasingly restless. She told her parents of strange dreams she couldn't quite explain. In these dreams, she lived in a house on the ground, not a stilt house. She had a brother named Dan. She had a mother who looked different from Mrs. Lowe, and she had died in a sudden accident involving a bicycle. At first, Mr. and Mrs. Lowe dismissed these claims as a child's imagination, but Mai was insistent. She could name the color of the house's roof, the layout of the yard, even where a guava tree stood behind the kitchen. She sobbed and pleaded, "I need to see my real mother and my brother Dan. They think I'm gone forever, but I'm here." Alarmed, her parents tried to calm her, telling her that this was her real home, that she was their beloved child. Yet Mai's stories only grew more detailed. She described a small stone marker near a river, remembering how her mother had wept there. She described dying from a fever, an infected wound on her foot. Then she demanded to see Mother Mai, the name of Dan's mother, a detail impossible for an 8-year-old stranger to guess. The Lows finally confided in an elder from their community, who recommended caution. "Sometimes wandering spirits latch onto children," he said. "A child's soul is vulnerable. But if this is truly a reincarnation, it must run its course. Denying it may worsen her anguish." Still, Mr. Lowe refused to even consider letting Mai run off to find another family. He worried it would break their hearts if she decided she belonged elsewhere. And so, he started locking Mai in her room at night, hoping she would forget these fantasies. The nights echoed with her cries, only fueling the tension in the household. Not long after, Mai managed to slip away one afternoon while her mother's back was turned. She ran through winding trails, past terraced fields shimmering with new rice shoots, her feet dusty and bare. Guided by an inexplicable certainty, she followed a path she seemed to know by heart, though logically, an 8-year-old living in the stilt house had never ventured that far. She reached the outskirts of Dan's village by late day. Locals saw this little Muong girl wandering around, tear-streaked, searching for someone named Dan. Some recognized her from chance meetings at the communal market, but had no idea why she was alone. One kindly woman asked, "Where's your mother, child?" Between sobs, I pleaded, "I need to find Dan. He lives near the big guava tree and a well with a chipped stone rim." The older woman realized that matched the house belonging to Mai and her grown son Dan. She accompanied the frantic girl to Mai's yard, calling out, "Sister Mai, is your son's name Dan? This little girl is in some kind of distress." Mai stepped outside, astonished by the sight. The child's eyes were wild with longing, her hair damp from running under the hot sun. Clutching Mai's hand, Mai exclaimed, "Mother, I'm back. It's me, Lon." Mai froze in place, confusion mingling with dread. Dan, returning from the fields, overheard the commotion and came around the corner. The moment Mai saw him, she burst into fresh tears. "Dan, don't you recognize me? I've wanted to come home so badly, but they wouldn't let me." Dan felt his chest tighten. His father had died without ever truly finding closure from Lan's death. Now this little girl from the neighboring highland village was claiming to be Lan reincarnated. It sounded impossible, a ghost story or fantasy. Yet there was an unearthly certainty in her voice. Crowds gathered as neighbors gawked from a distance, exchanging hushed whispers. "Is that the girl who said she's Lan come back to life?" Some were frightened, others merely curious. Mai knelt, studying the child's face. Mai's small foot bore a faint scar. She insisted, "That's where the bicycle spoke cut me." Hot tears leaked from Mai's eyes. She recalled Lan's final day, the makeshift bandage of mud, the terrifying onset of infection, the heartbreak of her last breath. Overcome, mais fainted. Neighbors carried her inside. Mai tried to follow, but Dan gently guided her to a bamboo bench. "We need to understand what's happening," he murmured. That evening, Mai refused to leave. She recounted detail after detail about Lan's favorite sweets, how Lan used to pick star-shaped blossoms from the hedgerow, the exact lullaby Mai sang at bedtime, even the arrangement of cups on a certain shelf. Dan listened, torn between skepticism and a pounding sense of awe. "How do you know all this?" he asked, voice trembling. "It's true, I used to hide those sweets behind the wooden pot. Only Lan knew about that place." Mai simply answered, "I remember it. I don't know how to explain, but it's been in my heart for so long." Word spread. Soon, some neighbors began cautioning Mai that if this child was truly the reincarnation of Lan, she might only bring more spiritual confusion to the household. Others insisted Mai and Dan accept her as family. The confusion deepened when Mai's parents arrived, frantic, furious at Mai's disappearance. They confronted Mai. "Your home is not her home," Mr. Lowe declared, eyes blazing. "We raised her for 8 years. We love her. She belongs in our stilt house." Mai clung to Mai's arm, sobbing, "No, I belong here. I just want to be with my mother and Dan." Tensions escalated. Mai herself was torn. While she yearned to believe Lan's spirit had returned, she also understood how heartbreaking it must be for Mr. and Mrs. Lowe. Gathering everyone, she tried to propose a compromise. "We aren't trying to steal your daughter. But can we talk? Can we figure out what's best for her, for all of us?" Mr. Lowe glared. "She's not your daughter. Not anymore. Let's go, Mai." He grabbed Mai's hand, pulling her away. The girl wailed, "Mother, Dan, help me." But she was taken back to the stilt house, locked in her room once again. That night, Dan lay awake, wrestling with swirling thoughts. He believed in the ancestors, in spirits, in the cycle of birth and death. Yet to see it made manifest was overwhelming. He recalled the sensation of Lan's small hand in his, the day they parted on the funeral's eve. His eyes filled with tears. Was it possible that the sister he had mourned for so long had returned, not as a ghost but in a new body? The next day, he found himself drifting around the boundary between the two villages, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Then he saw Mai, peeking from a tiny window on the second floor of the stilt house. She recognized him instantly, her expression lighting up. He saw a bruised mark on her wrist, evidence of how forcefully her father had dragged her home. Mai's pleas to see Mai and Dan fell on deaf ears. Mr. Lowe, though not cruel by nature, believed strongly that Mai was simply possessed by a restless spirit or influenced by wild imagination. Mrs. Lowe, meanwhile, was stricken by sadness. She could not bear the thought of losing her daughter, but also dreaded the constant turmoil Mai caused by insisting she had another family. Days passed. Mai refused food. She cried at night, calling for her real mother. Her health declined. A local healer was summoned, who brewed herbal concoctions to calm her mind. Mai's fevers and night terrors persisted. In a moment of desperation, Mrs. Lowe found Dan near the stilt house and quietly pulled him aside. "We can't keep going like this," she whispered. "Mai won't eat. She's so certain your mother is her mother." Tears sprang to her eyes. "What can we do? We love her, too." Dan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't want to break your family. But she has memories. We can't ignore them." With a trembling voice, Mrs. Lowe admitted, "I've had dreams, too. Dreams that Mai wasn't born to us by chance. I don't understand it, but perhaps we should speak with a spiritual medium. This is beyond our power." They agreed to keep the plan hidden from Mr. Lowe, fearing his rage. That night, Dan returned quietly, helping Mrs. Lowe sneak Mai out through the storage room's back ladder. Mai's face was gaunt but lit with joy at seeing Dan. They raced down the mountain path to a small shrine near the base of an ancient banyan tree, where an elderly medium named Madame AI performed nighttime readings. Madame AI lived in a ramshackle hut adjacent to the shrine. The interior was smoky with incense, cluttered with ritual objects, bronze gongs, wooden masks, half-burned candles, and tattered scrolls. Her hair was silver, skin wrinkled like dried fruit, but her eyes shone with uncanny sharpness. She beckoned them closer, instructing Mai to kneel upon a woven mat. Madame AI lit 3 tall sticks of incense and invoked the spirits, murmuring prayers in an archaic dialect. Then she fell silent. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded both ancient and childlike. "There is an unbroken thread from your past life to this one," she said to Mai. "Your death was abrupt, leaving behind longing and unfinished ties. Now you have re-entered these fields, this very land, to find those who grieved your passing." Dan's breath caught. Mai asked, "So it's true?" "I'm Lan." Madame AI turned her gaze to Mai's mother, who stood trembling. The child's past soul resonates strongly. You cannot force her to forget. Nor should you. Instead, acceptance might bring her peace. Her new parents and her old family must come together so she can heal. Tears welled in Mrs. Lowe's eyes. She realized in that moment how Mai truly believed in her previous identity, that none of this was a mere game. They sat in quiet reflection, the wind outside rustling banana leaves. Before dawn, Dan walked them back to the stilt house. Mai looked both relieved and anxious, relieved that the medium had validated her memories, anxious about how her father might react. When Mr. Lowe discovered they had visited Madame AI, he erupted in fury. For days, he refused to speak to his wife, chastising her for encouraging nonsense. Mai resumed her heartbreak, but Mr. Lowe confined her with even greater strictness. His anger, fueled by paternal protectiveness, showed no sign of abating. Meanwhile, Dan confided in Mai. She remained mostly silent, though tears glistened in her eyes. Softly, she said, "If it's truly Lan's soul, we must let her know she's always loved, but also that we respect the family who raised her in this life." Then, a fever struck Mai again, more severe than before. She fell unconscious, thrashing in delirium, calling out names and half-formed recollections. Mrs. Lowe, frantic, sent word to Dan, "Mai's not waking up. We need help." Dan rushed to the stilt house alongside Mai. Mr. Lowe barred the door, but then Mai let out a wail so chilling that he stepped aside. In the dimly lit main room, Mai lay on a bamboo pallet, soaked in sweat. She moaned words only Dan recognized. "Dan, the bicycle, it hurt so much." Mai's heart constricted. "Lon, my child," she whispered, kneeling, pressing a cool cloth to Mai's brow. Mai's eyes fluttered open. She stared at Mai, tears streaming. "Mama, I'm sorry I left you," she rasped, voice raw. Some deep paternal instinct flickered in Mr. Lowe as well. He realized that forcing Mai to deny these memories wasn't helping. If anything, her anguish only grew. Stunned by the raw emotion, he reluctantly allowed Mai and Dan to comfort Mai. For hours, they stayed by her side, taking turns sponging her forehead, coaxing water past her parched lips, whispering soothing words. By dawn, her fever broke. Exhausted, Mai slipped into a peaceful sleep. In the hush of early morning, Mr. Lowe approached Dan quietly. "You might think I'm heartless," he said, looking away, But she's my daughter. My wife carried her. I watched her take her first steps. His voice trembled. I cannot just let her run off. Dan's expression softened. I understand. Believe me, my mother and I don't want to lose her either. But maybe we can find a middle path. We can share her, in some way. She can live with you as she was born into your family now, but we can visit, show her love from her past. Mr. Lowe closed his eyes. The idea pained him, yet he saw no alternative if they wanted Mai to have any semblance of peace. A tentative agreement emerged. Mai would continue living with her Muong parents, but Mai and Dan would be acknowledged as her god family of sorts. She could visit them openly, without shame or secrecy. If Mai felt the need to connect with her past life memories, she would be free to do so. This arrangement was by no means simple. The community offered mixed reactions. Some found it heartwarming that two families could set aside differences to honor an extraordinary reincarnation. Others whispered superstitions. What if the child's spirit becomes restless again? Or what if Mai grows up confused, belonging to neither family fully? But all the speculation mattered less than Mai's well-being. Gradually, her nightmares receded. She regained her appetite and laughter. She visited Mai and Dan on weekends, learning to weave between both worlds. Her beloved stilt house in the Highlands, where her sisters teased her and her father taught her to fish, and the ground-level home of Mai and Dan, where she recognized the corners of the yard like an echo of memory. One afternoon, Dan found Mai perched at the base of a guava tree, humming a lullaby. He recalled how Lon used to hum that same tune. He softly approached. "You remember singing that?" Mai shrugged. "It just came to me. Mama, Mrs. Lowe, doesn't know it, but you do. I think we used to sing it together." Dan sat down in the grass, uncertain. "I used to sing it to Lon after Father died, to comfort her." He paused. "Does it ever scare you, having these memories from before?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It was scary at first because nobody believed me. But now I feel safe. I have two families who both love me." She smiled, small but bright. "I do wonder sometimes, why me? Why come back?" "Maybe you had a purpose," Dan said gently. "Something left undone. Or maybe it's fate." Mai leaned her head against Dan's shoulder, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. In that simple moment, any doubts Dan had melted away. She truly was land spirit, reborn with a second chance to experience childhood without tragedy. Still, old wounds lingered. Mai occasionally relived the pain of her accident in dreams. Once, she woke screaming about a bicycle, mud caked on her foot, the feeling of suffocating. On hearing these episodes, Mai wept, remembering how she had lost Lon so abruptly. Urged by Madame AI, Dan and Mai decided to confront the site of the original accident, a place where an old dirt road met a shallow ditch, near a stand of bamboo. The neighbor who had taken Lon on the bike ride had long since moved away, haunted by guilt. Now, a battered shrine stood at that intersection, dedicated to travelers who met misfortune. Locals left flowers and incense there. Dan and Mai arrived in the late afternoon, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. Mai's steps slowed as they neared the spot. Her breath grew ragged. Fragments of memory flashed. Spinning spokes panic, the neighbor's trembling hands as he pressed clumps of muddy earth against her wound. Tears welled in Mai's eyes. She turned to Dan, voice quivering. This is where it happened, right?" He nodded, unable to speak at first. "Yes. I never told you exactly, but you recognized it." "You always do," he said, voice trembling. She sank to her knees, pressing her palms to the ground, as though searching for something intangible. Dan knelt beside her, and they lit sticks of incense. A light breeze stirred the smoke. Mai bowed her head and murmured a prayer for the lost child she had once been. Dan's own tears fell, quiet but intense. For a moment, it felt as if a circle was closing. The sorrow that weighed on them for over a decade lifted, replaced by a quiet acceptance that life could contain heartbreak and miraculous second chances. In the following months, an unspoken closeness formed between Mr. Lowe and Mai. They remained formal, but slowly developed mutual respect. Whenever Mai visited, Mr. Lowe insisted on accompanying her so he could speak with Mai, to ensure no hidden manipulations were taking place. In time, these stiff visits softened. He saw Mai's genuine maternal love for Mai and realized she posed no threat to his own paternal role. Mai's older siblings at the stilt house also grew curious about her other family. They teased her less, eventually visiting Mai's home, bringing small gifts of fruit or hand-woven scarves. A special day arrived. Mai turned 9. Typically, in the Stilt house, birthdays were modest events with home-cooked dishes and family blessings. This time, Mai asked if she could celebrate with both families together. Mr. Lowe hesitated, worried about the gossip, but could not deny her wish. So, an afternoon feast was prepared at Mai's home. Long wooden tables under a makeshift canopy offered steaming pots of rice, fresh vegetables, grilled fish, and tangy sauces. Mai wore a colorful woven sash from her Muong heritage, along with a small jade pendant Mai had once given to Lon. People from both villages gathered, some curious, some supportive, others skeptical but polite. When Mai blew out the candles on a simple homemade cake, she closed her eyes. Dan asked, "What did you wish for?" Mai's eyes sparkled. "For everyone to be happy that I'm here, that we can all be family." Tears glimmered in Mai's gaze as she kissed Mai's forehead. Mr. Lowe ruffled her hair. Even if it was unusual, they were forging a new kind of bond that transcended a single lifetime. Time marched on, weaving the daily rhythms of farm work, schooling, festivals, and family chores. Mai excelled at her lessons, always reading beyond her grade level. Dan guided her, teaching her local history, and when she asked, telling stories of their father and the younger land's mischief from long ago. Every so often, a wave of sadness hit. Mai felt the phantom ache in her foot, recalling the day she bled on the roadside. Or Mai would tear up, remembering the father who never got to see Lon reborn. But these pangs were softened by the knowledge that Mai was alive and thriving, a living testament to second chances. When Mai turned 11, a traveling Buddhist nun visited the region, offering special prayers at the local pagoda. She spoke about karma, samsara, and the possibility of enlightened rebirths. Intrigued, Mai, Dan, and Mr. and Mrs. Lowe joined the chanting session. Incense smoke curled overhead, the rhythmic beating of the wooden fish drum echoing across the courtyard. After the ceremony, the nun invited Mai forward. She placed a gentle hand on Mai's shoulder. "You have a rare blessing, child," she said softly. "You carry the memory of another life, but you have found acceptance and love in this one. Cherish that." Mai nodded, solemn yet glowing with gratitude. Dan, standing behind her, felt an uncanny sense that Mai's path was indeed shaped by some benevolent force, whether it be fate, cosmic design, or simply the unstoppable power of familial love that transcended a single lifetime. The years continued passing, bringing new changes to the two villages. Modern roads replaced dusty lanes, electricity and internet arrived, and more children pursued education beyond the local schools. Yet nestled in that evolving landscape stood two families intertwined by an extraordinary secret. Mai, now 14, balanced high school classes with chores. She spent weekdays in the Stilt house, laughing with her siblings, helping her mother spin yarn, listening to her father's gentle flutes in the evening. On weekends, she often visited Mai and Dan, sometimes staying overnight, hearing stories of her father's youth or her grandfather's war tales, stories that Lon had missed hearing the first time. She developed a habit of journaling her reflections, an attempt to merge the two sets of memories swirling in her mind. "I love both families," she wrote. "I was Lon, I am Mai. Sometimes it confuses me, but mostly it makes me feel special, like the world gave me a second chance." At 17, Mai graduated with honors. She planned to attend a teacher training college in a nearby city, bridging her Muong heritage with the broader Vietnamese culture. To celebrate, both families threw a communal feast once more, echoing the earlier birthday celebration. Dan, now nearly 30, looked on with pride, remembering how uncertain everything seemed when she was 8. In the hush of that evening, Mai said goodbye to each family member before leaving for college. She embraced Mr. Lowe, Mrs. Lowe, her siblings, grateful for the life they had given her in this incarnation. Then she turned to Mai and Dan, hugging them tightly. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered, even when it seemed impossible. Dan brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We're proud of you. Go chase your dreams. We'll always be here if you need us." Mai pressed a small cloth pouch into Mai's hand. Inside is a keepsake from the first Lon. Open it when you're ready. It's for remembering who you were and who you are. Overwhelmed, Mai nodded, tucking the pouch safely into her bag. The next morning, she boarded a rickety bus and departed for the city. As the vehicle trundled away, the Stilt house and Mai's home receded into the distance. but the bond they shared remained vivid in Mai's heart. A year later, Mai returned for a visit, looking more mature, hair trimmed in a modern style. She carried new books, stories of the world beyond their villages. Mr. Lowe proudly introduced her around as his daughter who was studying to become a teacher. Mai invited her to spend a few days at the ground-level house. That evening, Mai wandered into the yard, gazing at the guava tree, memories drifting like ghosts of a half-remembered dream. She pulled out the small cloth pouch, curious. Inside, she found a faded piece of ribbon. The same ribbon Lon had worn in her hair on the day she died. Gently, she touched it to her cheek, as though bridging the past and present. A sense of profound gratitude washed over her. Gratitude for the second life, for both sets of parents who nurtured her, for a brother who welcomed her back despite heartbreak. In the distance, the river that claimed Lan's life continued to flow, unchanged and eternal. Mai thought she could almost hear its rippling voice call out, "We carry away some things, but sometimes we bring them back too." There, under a sky flecked with stars, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise, to live fully, in honor of both her past and her present. As long as she remembered who she was, no tragedy could truly separate her from the one she loved. Her two families had proven that love could conquer the boundaries of death and time, weaving a tapestry of acceptance and hope. In that quiet moment, the complexities of her existence felt less like a burden and more like a blessing, an affirmation that the cycle of life and death can, sometimes, grant a second chance. And so, the story of Mai, once Lon, reached far beyond the banks of that winding river, carried by the voices of villagers who spoke in hushed wonder at the miracle they had witnessed.